All right. Oh, that's a little hot. Get everybody awake before the potluck. Then we'll go in food coma later. Unfortunately, we get the nice convenience of the tables right outside. That's what happens when you show up on a holiday. We get everything closer together. So we're going to talk a little bit about this first of the kind of the biblical trips to Egypt. You know, as we've talked before, I love how God tends to repeat these stories and the maps and the journeys. And sometimes it's part of our stubbornness at times not to hear from God or not to hear the lesson the first time. I've certainly repeated a few, and I share Colin's frustration with drivers that do not drive well. So I apparently have to go through traffic over and over again. And just for review from yesterday, Colin's big idea was we forget God, but he never forgets us. And I think this is such an important component of grace that, in spite of our failings, quite frankly, that God is sufficient for all of our needs, that he is a loving, forgiving, gracious God and says, I've chosen you before you were even conceived in your mother's womb. I knit you together there for purpose. And some of you remember Genesis 1 and 2 and the amazingness of biology that, the world keeps trying to chalk up to statistical coincidence. And yet, they'll accept that it's foolish to mathematically to play the lottery at about 1 in 300 million odds. And yet it's science to say 1 in 400 trillion odds of DNA evolving the way it has is logical. And so it's interesting. Some of the key concepts that fear makes us forget. And I've used for years the acronym FEAR stands for false expectations appearing real. If God goes before us, literally what can stand against us? And I think it's real that all of us at a visceral gut level feel it and can sense fear at times and worry. It's a very human characteristic, and yet God is constantly saying to people like Joshua, be strong and courageous, or fear not, to so many people as around the birth story of Christ. And yet we have to wrestle through this. We have to recognize that sometimes the logical and obvious reality is things are going to go badly for us. And yet, God, if he's calling us somewhere, makes provision. Now, I've made the mistake of thinking God was calling me somewhere, and I got a door slammed in my face as God was redirecting. And so I encountered the reality of God's correction or rebuke or clear stop sign, if you will. But in the places God's called me that he said, this is the place I want you, he's done some miraculous things in my journey that I know with absolute certainty that had he not shown up, it would not have gone well, or not gone at all. Forgetting makes us foolish. Many of you probably remember Forrest Gump, stupid is as stupid does. And I think there's times when God looks and says, why are you doubting me? And very often it's we've forgotten the other times God's shown up. We've forgotten the fact that God has provided consistently for us. And after a certain number of years on this earth and a certain number of times where God intervenes, yes, of course, if we remembered all of those in every moment, it'd probably get a little easier. But as they say, the memory's the second to go, I just can't remember the first. So mine's now biological. It's not even spiritual anymore. And that faith makes us faithful. It's the exercising of our faith. I think faith is a spiritual muscle, if you will, that if we use it, it continues to stay strong. If we don't, it atrophies and it weakens. And I think this is part of why God occasionally puts us in these tough predicaments and tough circumstances to say, look, I'm trying to keep you in your best, in the midst of faith, in the midst of this journey. I don't want you to fall distant or forget. There are certainly times I go, I'd like the easy button, God. I prefer to skip the hard part of this. I don't really need to go through the desert, do I? Can't we take the express train to wherever we're going? And at the end of the day, he never forgets, except our sin, which I think is part of grace, that God will put and blot out sin, but he doesn't forget us. He doesn't forget the journey. He hasn't forgotten the gifts he's instilled in us and our limits. You know, Paul even talks about the earthen vessels being filled with his Spirit. I think it's the encouragement to say in our weakness, God is glorified. In our inabilities, that's sometimes where we have our greatest witness, because God does show up, and people might, as non-believers, go, how come you responded that way? Or how come it worked out differently for you? Or why are you confident of an outcome? Those are great conversation starters from an evangelical perspective, because they're initiating it. They're seeing something maybe imperfectly in us, but they've seen something different. And so my big idea for today is that God is faithful in rescuing his people, even when his people are themselves unfaithful. You know, thank God, as we see these stories throughout the Old Testament, and even a few in the New, that God, in spite of us, makes his will manifest, in spite of our failings, in spite of the things that we do, maybe that are, quite frankly, self-damaging, that he shows up and says, I'm going to make a path for your salvation, for your redemption, for the mistakes that you've made not to have the natural consequences that might come. And there's some key concepts we'll see kind of unpacked today, but one of them is that hardships challenge our faith. You know, that's the reality. And I think a lot of times we can look at somebody that's been on a journey and see how they operate in their faith, and we start going, well, how come I don't have faith like that? Well, maybe you just haven't had to overcome some of the obstacles and hurdles somebody else has. You know, there may be some realities around the kinds of things, the inner journey, the outer journey struggles that have gone on. One that has been very, very clear to me that I forget constantly is our plans are not God's plans. I'm always inviting God to join me in my plans, and once in a while I remember to ask him, okay, where are you moving? And let me go join you there. You know, very often I'll ask God, bless me and my idea, rather than let me experience the blessing of following your idea. And it may seem subtle, but it's critical in that journey. And it's not to say we don't pray. It's not to say that God doesn't occasionally miraculously spare us from hardships. But the bulk of the time, in my experience, God has a purpose and a plan behind pain. C.S. Lewis said, pain is God's megaphone. And for those of us that are a little hard of hearing, it helps. You know, that he gets to us and he starts to, you know, get through those resistance points or those areas we're scared to do something that he's called us to do. That God can use our failures as part of his blessing is such a redemptive and positive thought, because sometimes we'll wrestle through or we'll feel guilt for how we failed in the past. And the good news in my experience is God doesn't waste those moments. He doesn't, you know, cast aside our failures, but instead uses it and knits it into this fabric. You know, I don't know how many of you have ever seen the backside of a tapestry, but it's got all these knots and frayed string and everything else. Yet the front side is this beautiful picture. And I think in this earth, we're stuck seeing the backside of God's tapestry. You know, that we're seeing the knots and the imperfections and the flaws, and it's only when we really get to heaven we see the other side of what he knit together through all the thousands of years of human history, including ours, to build his complete picture, to build his kingdom, to build this portrait of himself manifest through humanity. And once in a while, we get those opportunities. We're talking to somebody who's really struggling, and we've happened to have gone through the same thing they've gone through. And we can be an encouragement. We can be part of hope in their life because we saw through whatever the hardship was, sickness, you know, death of a loved one, you know, ill health, the process of God seeming distant spiritually, where it seemed like we were in the desert spiritually. It was a dry time. You know, those are hard things when people are going through them. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that failure is not how we define it, it's how God uses it for his ultimate glory. Because to the non-believer, if you were somehow able to be virtually perfect, they'd go, that I can't do that. But when you're flawed, we have a legitimate ability to have testimony around, look, I'm flawed like you are. The only difference is I occasionally get God as the wind in my sails. I occasionally get it right. I see his presence. I trust him, and he shows up. That's the only difference. You know, the human condition fundamentally has not changed. I mean, it's the beauty about Genesis, looking, call it roughly 8,000 years back, you know, to this story. If the flawed people we see in Genesis can ultimately be deemed heroes of the faith, you know, recorded as examples. You know, Abram is a father of at least 3 major religions. Isn't it encouraging that we might be able to be used by God in spite of our failures? And ultimately, God can use even his enemies for our good. You know, and obviously God in multiple cases used a Pharaoh of Egypt for the blessing of his people, even if they weren't willing initially. So, you know, when we look at this idea of ancient Egypt at the time, it really was a little bit more of the area closer to the Mediterranean Sea. Nubia was down south a little bit of this map, but at the end of the day, you can kind of see it. They had some influence in Canaan for a couple thousand years. Obviously, places like Giza with great pyramids and the Sphinx, and you know, there were so many of these kind of ancient things that we still struggle to understand to this day how they did it. It's pretty amazing when you think about 3,000-4,000 years before Christ. This was a significant civilization, and the Nile River provided, you know, kind of the substance of the time. It's also interesting when we compare kind of Abram versus where the Israelites will come back to this story in the bookends, if you will, where Abram travels to Egypt because of famine. Likewise, obviously, the Israelites traveled to Egypt because of a famine. That Abram was afraid he would be killed by Pharaoh, mainly for his wife, where Israel faces being killed by Pharaoh for the orders at the time of killing all the male babies as a threat that Pharaoh took. You know, that Sarai was taken into the house of a Pharaoh. Likewise, Israel was taken into bondage, and ultimately Moses into the house of Pharaoh. That Pharaoh in this first account was stricken by some kinds of plagues or illness. Obviously, we know in Exodus, the house of Pharaoh and the entire land of Egypt was hit by plagues. And then Pharaoh at the end says, now here's your wife, take her and go. Likewise to the Israelites, you know, take your flocks, your herds, and go. And so there's these interesting parallels that we can see, and I don't think it's coincidence that God's repeating these stories in a slightly different fashion, mainly to give us hope that this wasn't a one and done miracle. It wasn't once in God's history that he intervened for those who he cared for. That we have hope even as a modern culture that God will continue to intervene. So dating exactly the most early patriarchs gets a little challenging. You know, the best timeline I think I would argue for is somewhere around 2100 BC. To give you some perspective around the history of Egypt at the time, you had the Old Kingdom, it was about 2600 to 2100. You know, what's called the first intermediate period, kind of a dark period in Egypt's history. Very little records, archaeological records that said, here's what exactly was going on between about 2100 and almost 2000. Then you had the Middle Kingdom from 2000 to about 1700 BC. Probably it fell during that first intermediate period because we don't see a ton of records around this. There is archaeological and some sociological evidence. There was about a 300-year period around there where even Egypt was hit with some levels of drought, and the Nile wasn't overflowing its riverbanks as it normally would do to fertilize even their crops. Obviously, if we think about where Abram was right before this in the Negev, the desert, if it's not getting normal rainfall in Egypt, it really has not got much rain in the desert. Probably all those rivers and springs and pools of water dried up. And so this is something that scholars have debated. There was even some argument looking at this timeline versus when Exodus might have been within about 100 or 200 year period of time, you've certainly got some flex, but you'll at least get a sense this was an established empire. At the time he would have been there, we see kind of the Sphinx and the pyramids and some of the Egyptian ruins literally now 4,000 plus years later, 5,000 years later, and go, oh, well, it's something out in the middle of the desert. At the time, this would have been a thriving community, a thriving empire. We saw some evolution even of the Egyptian pyramids. This is one of those early forms where it was a little more rounded, certainly not the traditional pyramid shape that we think of today. And the Sphinx would be probably a few hundred years before Abram was there. So we have some ability to say this was one of the great periods of Egyptian influence. They dipped down for a little while and came back into a little more power for another almost 1,000 years. And drilling in a little bit, most of this would have been taking place, or the sphere of influence of the Pharaoh at the time would have been in what we call Lower Egypt, closer to the Mediterranean, because there was a civil war going probably during that first intermediate period in Upper Egypt and towards Nubia that would have had some level of influence. And so, it was still a significant area. It was not as big as modern-day Egypt is, but you can kind of see to the left side, Libya, and then to the right side would have been traditional Israel, at the time Canaan. So that gives you a little bit of sense. You had influence from the Phoenicians going up towards Greece, and then you had Crete that at the time had a fair amount of sailing ships that would have been part of the trading partners with Egypt. So this would have been a pretty central hub. And I think this is something we see again repeated in the New Testament, that although Israel was a colony or province of Rome, as we hear from history, all the roads led to Rome. The Greeks and then later the Romans all had a common language and a common trade, and it allowed the stories, if you will, of the gospel to spread across the known world at the time. Picking Egypt was a very central focus to the core of the empire, or the influence of the empire at the time. And so I think it's interesting that we see this starting to set up, ultimately culminating with the Israelites being taken to slavery, and then in Exodus, them leaving, going back to Israel. So there's a couple of choices we're going to look at today. The first of them is, what are Abrams' choices, or Abraham's? Famine pushed him towards Egypt. As I mentioned, there was this significant drought cycle that would have been going on just from the evidence we have. It's totally logical that if it was struggling in Egypt with a Nile River, it certainly would have been problematic in the desert. Out of fear, he told Sarai to lie about being his sister. His fears were not unfounded. There are some other writings we've seen at the time of the Egyptians killing people for possessions, wives. So it wasn't that he had lost his mind and this was a completely irrational fear. There was grounding for it. He would have known culturally that it would have been very possible that they would have dealt with him very harshly. What kills me is he does it again, as we'll see in Genesis 20, and then his son Isaac does it again in 26. And so, again, in the stupid as the stupid does camp, we can draw some consolation from the fact that even, a father of a great nation, a father of the faith, blew it multiple times. You'd think, after the first time, he'd kind of get this picture, okay, maybe I don't need to do this again. But not only did he do it again, but the sins of the father passed to the son, and the son did it. And he had to have heard the stories. I mean, Isaac couldn't have been naive to knowing this had happened. He took gifts from Pharaoh like a dowry. I mean, there were cattle and gold and silver and blessings that came from Sarai being in the court. And he built wealth in Egypt. And as Colin alluded to, this was part of the promise of God of making him a great nation and blessing him with material wealth. Beyond that this was one of those ways God had ordered that he would get wealth. Now, we also see Pharaoh's princes, probably sons, pointing out that Sarah was beautiful. Now, of course, they were talking about physical beauty, but I always think it's important we define how does God think about beauty, because it is more than skin deep. It's more than just physical. We see God talking about that he honors a pure heart, that our spiritual nature and how we behave spiritually, God finds beautiful. Our character matters. These are things that when we see the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, these are the things that God has admonished us to build and to work on, and our virtues. And I think faith is one of those, or the lack of it at times. That these are the things that God finds honorable and worthy of respect. And Micah 6:8, you probably have heard before, but I think it summarizes well this idea. He has told you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Sometimes we make Christianity or the spiritual pursuit way more complicated than it needs to be. And it's funny, as the Pharisees were trying to trap Jesus, they're trying to get him in this grand debate. Well, what's the greatest commandment? Give us all this, things that we can get around and debate. And he really strips it down. He says, love your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbors yourself. If you do that stuff, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, the rest of it kind of comes along. There's a whole lot of things we don't get tripped up on if we're doing those basic things. Now, way easier said than done. We've all had situations where people treat us horribly, and it hurts, emotionally, psychologically. We don't necessarily go, let me love you. That's my first response. But I do think it's important that we recognize that the creator of the universe, who did create physical beauty in the universe. I mean, amazing sunset, that interesting time of day when the light is golden and reflecting through the leaves of a tree or wherever it may be that you see it in nature. Absolutely true. But for us as humans, trying to be mirrors of his image, of his will, I think he defines it much more about our choices and our character and our behavior than any other attribute. Pharaoh made some choices in this journey. He took Sarai into his household. He saw a beautiful woman. He wanted it. He probably had quite the concubine accumulation, and so this became part of his household. Part of his own pride, ego. I mean, we see it in Solomon as well. That was one of his downfalls, was taking many wives. He dealt well with Abram. He dealt fairly with him and honorably with him when he didn't have to. Here's a foreigner. He could have done something else, but he didn't. He rebuked Abram for lying. At the end of the day, when it was found out, there was a pretty harsh criticism, like, how dare you lie to me about this? You've caused these plagues. And I think it's interesting that when he sent him away, he sent him with all his possessions. He didn't take back the stuff he'd given him. That could have been a very reasonable response. Not only did you bring these plagues to my house, but you lied to me, so I'm taking back the stuff I gave you. But he didn't. And I think D.A. Carson says it well. Those that profess religion and do that which is unfair and disingenuous or lie, they must expect to hear about it. And maybe some of you have had the same thing where in your spiritual walk and your journey, non-believers called out one of your behaviors. And it hurts, and it's very easy at times to get mad about it. Well, you try this. But I think God holds us to the standard, and he's saying, look, people are watching. The world sees our choices, our actions, and they measure, fairly or unfairly, the truth of Scripture based upon what they see. I heard years ago a great quote, and it said, you may be the only Bible that most people ever read. The New Ryan version is not very good, let me tell you. It's not even a loose translation if somebody's reading my life. But it is in the back of my mind constantly that I do have a witness, and people are watching, and they want to see what is truth for me. And some, quite frankly, probably like it when they see me fall. There is a certain level of daytime television that goes on in life. The drama zone, if you will. And to the degree I'm capable, I'd like to stay out of that because I think there are more important things. I also think it's interesting when we look at God's intervention in this equation, where he did deliver Sarai from danger. He pulled her out of Pharaoh's household. He chastised Pharaoh. Even though Pharaoh was deceived, he still said that, he was wrong and put the curses in. And many would argue that was...
Shoot, I didn't finish.
Yeah. Go back to this one.
Technology.
Yeah. Why is that? There it goes. That you still see this idea of God stopping Pharaoh from worse sin, of ending a set of choices that would have led to something even worse. And I think sometimes it's easy for me at least to go, well, why, God, am I having to deal with this problem right now? And I think sometimes in hindsight, I look back at some of those and God was saying, look, I'm trying to keep you from making an even worse mistake. That left to your own devices, you'd continue down a path that was really not healthy and not constructive. And so I'm going to put in barriers or hardships or things that slow you down from worse sin, from worse decisions. It's interesting to me where God even protects Abram from the reprisal. The negative consequence that could have been very logical from this situation, God really helped him avoid in this process. And he allowed Abram to keep that wealth and to return to the promised land. That in spite of Abram's failings, God said, I'm going to still allow you this wealth because it's part of what I promised you. I'm going to send you back to the promised land now that the famine's probably over in the timing of this event. And you're going to be better off in spite of your sin. There's a few observations that I make in this, and one of them is my big idea. God is faithful in rescuing his people even when his people are unfaithful. But I think it starts to blend into a couple other key ideas, that the partners in sin are justly made partners in the punishment. And I think this is one of those things that gets very interesting when you get to the place where somebody even remains silent in someone else's sin. And the New Testament has a logical and stated process that if we see a brother and sister in sin, we go to them and we try to be redemptive and encourage them to come back. If that doesn't work, we take two or more. And if that still doesn't work, and there's a rebellious heart, then we deal with bringing in elders and providing some church discipline and correction along the process. Because sometimes the path of least resistance is for us just to wash our hands and ignore a problem and a brother or sister is having. And I don't think that is the intent. And I think it's interesting that the whole of Pharaoh's household, and certainly the princes that originally identified Sarah, were also afflicted by these plagues. The bystanders, if you will, had a spillover effect. In my life, I have to be cognizant that if I sin, it spills over into my family. It can spill over into my friends. There is a cost to the people around me if I'm not functioning the way that God intended me to function. There's those that are lost that may never hear the gospel in my doing nothing. And so I think this is something that we have to take seriously, that God is a just God. He does spare us from his worst of judgment, but there are natural consequences that get put into these equations. And probably there's some innocent members in Pharaoh's household that still suffered a consequence. But I think we can draw from that the parallel, and we see this fairly well articulated through the New Testament, of not just ignoring someone else's sin, not that we are to be judgmental about it, but in grace and love we do speak the truth. We come alongside and we encourage people because it's not best for them. If we do it from the right motive and the loving heart, it still may be rejected, but at least we stand blameless before God that we've done our best to try to help the circumstance. And I think many of us have done this journey long enough that we have accumulated some hard-fought wisdom to share with someone that may be less mature in the faith. If you've ever had the opportunity to disciple someone that's a brand new believer, it's like watching a toddler play in traffic. You're constantly like, no, not there. And yet, God has put us in some people's lives to stop that most dangerous of activities and be patient that they will learn some of the things we've learned. And it's not a chronological issue. It's one of a spiritual connection with God and just being in this journey long enough to, quite frankly, have some of the failings, to have made our share of mistakes and hopefully learn from them by the second or third time. And I think that's where it's important for us to think as New Testament believers, what are the things and circumstances God's put me in that I need to be speaking into to get someone else's best? And finally, I think this idea, those that serve others' lust must expect to share in their plague or their plight. And I think we live in a culture that has almost, glorified unhealthy sexual choice at an extreme level, and has corrupted what God said is good, is meant to be a blessing within the confines of marriage, and it's been twisted. But I think it's very hard in this culture to avoid anything that is a negatively portrayed version of sexuality. And so it's this constant rub of, okay, how do I intervene in a loving and redemptive way, not just in a judgmental way, not just to reject the community around us, but to embrace it and say, look, there is something better here. Let me share with you what I've learned. And at the end of the day, God graciously overrides even the mistakes of those he's called for their long-term benefit. And this one, to me, I bolded because it's been so true in my life, and I'm so appreciative that God stopped me in the midst of my mistakes, in the midst of my sin, over and over and over again, and provided a way out, or a rebuke. It may have stung at the time, it may have hurt, I may have resembled the remark, but at the end of the day, he was redemptive, and he didn't allow me to stay in sin or waywardness or outside of his will, and instead draw me back to him. And some of those seasons took time. It wasn't an overnight thing in most cases, but I saw repeatedly where God kept coming alongside or bringing people in my sphere of influence, or sometimes total strangers, giving me a book or a word that was part of this reinforcement of God's messaging. And the fact that in spite of my fleshly desires, my errors, my will, that God's will has triumphed is a miracle. It is a redemptive act by him. And so I think this is something that's worthy of thinking about, and not just go, well, how could Abram have made these choices? Because we've all made mistakes. But isn't it amazing that God, in spite of those mistakes, still blesses him and still brings him to a place of significant influence, and that Paul in Hebrews puts him in the hall of faith of great men of the faith. And we'll see certainly more chapters to come where this wasn't his only mistake. We'll have a few to count by the time we're done. And again, him lying even a second time about Sarah being his wife. It's just amazing that we get to look at one of the people who we would ascribe as being the father of this path that ultimately led to the Savior, the Messiah, was just as flawed and human as possibly imaginable. And yet God chose him for a purpose, for a reason, and was redemptive through him for all nations at the end of the day. If that's possible, our mistakes don't seem so problematic. They don't seem permanent. They seem temporal where they belong, and we can make different decisions and different choices today, and God just takes away the natural consequence so many times of that sin if we'll repent and go, I got it wrong. The irony is we don't really even see him repent. I'm sure that was probably implied, but it wasn't really till he got caught that any of the story changed. And so there's some questions for us to think about. And we'll break up into a couple of, smaller groups, 2, 3, 4 people, whatever, and you can pick any question you like out of the list. Some are harder than others, but where are you tempted to lie to protect yourself? I think sometimes it's easy in these Old Testament stories just to go, well, that's silly. I certainly have areas that I would prefer not be put on spotlight, and so it's easy sometimes to kind of change the reality to fit our narrative. Have you had a time of hardship that's caused you to doubt God? One of those moments in the desert for yourself, spiritually, physically, whatever. Where do you find security and comfort? We know that Abram thought it would come in the material blessing. He found out the hard way that God sees through all of the deceit, all of the sin, all of the best efforts to find it on our own. Or talk about an example where God spared you from your own sin, where in his grace he redeemed you or stopped you from experiencing the worst outcome that could have been the natural byproduct of the sin. So we'll take about 5 minutes and go through these questions and some groups, and we'll come back together and wrap up.